You're listening to episode 192 of Lifestyle Locker Radio with Dr. Cyrus Khambatta. Hello, I'm Dr. Josh Hand, and you are listening to Lifestyle Locker Radio, where we talk about all things lifestyle, from health to fitness, to nutrition and peak performance, to mental fitness, and taking on some of life's most challenging obstacles. And for our guests today, we encourage that you look at the show notes to check out their complete bio and links. We want this show to be designed for you to listen to the show and not hear us just talk about our guests or ourselves. We also encourage that you comment, review, and share this show if you are enjoying it from wherever and whenever you're listening. Lastly, we encourage you to check out all the links that we provide in the show notes. They are there for you, for your health, for your lifestyle. We ultimately want you to unleash your human potential. So dive into this episode, and we'll see you on the inside. Hey everyone, welcome back to Lifestyle Locker Radio. We have an amazing guest today, Cyrus. We are here and we're going to be talking about mastering diabetes. And if you are watching this, you get to look at Cyrus and go, there's no way this guy has diabetes. Look, he's a super fit guy. And you're just gonna, you may think a little bit because type 1, type 2 diabetes, we're gonna go into some details and he's gonna share what those are for those that may not even know some of the differences. But if you are a person that has type 1 and or type 2 diabetes, pay attention because you're gonna get some amazing content today. So Cyrus, welcome.
Thanks so much, Dr. Josh. I appreciate you having me here today. I'm looking forward to it.
I am pumped to have you actually. And just so all of you know, I'm in New York, as many of you know, but we're crossing country lines here. We're in Costa Rica at the same time. And I'm jealous of his weather. He's got a tank top on, and the windows and doors open. So
it's probably 50 degrees warmer where I am right now than it is where you are, but
I would say so. So Cyrus, tell us a little bit of your backstory, because as we were talking pre-show, diabetes isn't something you just said, maybe I want to get into teaching people about getting healthy from diabetes.
Yeah, exactly right. So I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when I was 22. So I was a senior in college and I was just sort of graduating, trying to move on with my life. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I get very thirsty and super, super tired. And I was trying to study for finals. I couldn't concentrate. And my thirst was unbelievable, Josh. I was drinking between 1 and 2 gallons of water per day, just literally out of nowhere. So I would drink water on a normal basis, but then all of a sudden I got thirstier. And it felt like, I remember I was kind of going crazy for a while because I would drink some water, I would put a glass down and I was like, I'm thirstier. Then I would drink a glass and I put it back down. And I was like, I'm thirstier. And it was like the exact opposite was happening. It was supposed to be less thirsty. And it got to a point where I was sitting there on my desk and I was like, I'm going insane. I don't understand what is happening right now.
Huh.
And then because I was taking on so many fluids, I would go to the bathroom and I would urinate 18, 20 times a day. So I picked up the phone. I called my sister, who's a doctor of osteopathy. And I said, hey, Shanaz, what the heck is going on with me? Here's my symptoms. And she started crying immediately. She was like, Cyrus, just drop everything you're doing. Go to the health center right now. So I show up at the health center. They check my blood glucose and my glucose is over 600. Your glucose is supposed to be between 80 and 130 on a daily basis. Like if we checked your blood glucose at any given moment in time, you'd be within that range.
Okay.
But I was basically 6 times higher than I was supposed to be. And as a result of that, I was like, I don't even understand what this means. So they took me to the hospital. They injected saline into one arm. They gave me an IV of insulin into the other arm. And they basically were like, hey, we're going to, sorry, you have type 1 diabetes. There's nothing we can do about it. But now we have to use insulin to control your blood glucose. This is literally Greek to me. I don't even understand what is happening. So I was under their control for 24 hours. They discharged me from the hospital with a set of instructions about what I'm supposed to do, 2 prescriptions for insulin, syringes, a blood glucose meter, test strips, a carbohydrate counting guide, a life alert bracelet, and a diagnosis of not 1, but 3 autoimmune conditions.
Wait, so tell me how old you are again?
22.
22, everybody. Pay attention.
So yeah, I'm 22 years old. Unbelievable. I mean, this was like the best and worst 24 hours of my life. And so they diagnosed me with type 1 diabetes. But they also diagnosed me with 2 other autoimmune conditions while I was in the hospital that I wasn't fully aware that all of these were related to each other. The other 2 were Hashimoto's hypothyroidism, which is autoimmune attack of the thyroid, leading to decreased thyroid production. And then number 2, alopecia universalis, which is why, as you can see, I have no hair, I have no eyebrows, I have no eyelashes, nothing. I'm a hairless wonder. All 3 of those are autoimmune conditions. And the doctors looked at me and they were like, we've never seen someone with these 3 conditions before. We don't know what to do. But we can tell you that because you're living with type 1 diabetes, you have to eat a low carbohydrate diet because that's the way to control your blood glucose. So I said, okay, great. What does that mean? I said, we want to try and limit your intake of fruits, potatoes, rice, breads, cereals, pastas, and we want to increase your intake of turkey, lean meat, fish, chicken, peanut butter, milk, eggs, bacon. And I was like, okay, sounds good to me. I'll do that. So I did that for the first year of my life with diabetes, and it was supposed to make my blood glucose more controllable, but it did the opposite.
Really? Okay.
It did the opposite. Now it could be that maybe I just didn't get it right. Maybe I just suck at eating a low carbohydrate diet. That's a possibility. But I was trying to be pretty darn diligent, and I was like tracking what I was eating, and I was following recipes, and I was really trying to put in an effort here. And my blood glucose was just doing crazy stuff. So on a given day, my glucose could be as low as a 55, which is in the hypoglycemic territory, or it could be as high as 255 or 355. And it was
that's a big swing. I mean, and both of them are going to give different types of symptoms, right? That hypoglycemic, people have definitely felt that before, like low blood sugar, like I'm going to pass out type of thing.
Yeah, it's not fun at all. The hypoglycemia is terrible because you get the shaky hands and slurred speech, and you can't see properly. It's not a fun place to be. But it's one thing if you had a collection of isolated hypoglycemias or hyperglycemias, low or high blood glucose. But it's another thing altogether if that's happening at least once or twice a day, every single day. Or if you have days where you go low, high, low, high, 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 low, low, high, low, it just zaps you. It's so frustrating. So I was doing that for, the better part of a year. And then at a certain point I was like, I just cannot do this anymore. So I started looking for information, started reading and talking to people, and one thing led to another. And for whatever reason, the idea of eating a plant-based diet just got put inside of my universe. And I was like, plant-based diet, what is this all about? This is kind of different. Mm-hmm. And so I said, hey, you know what? Let me reserve my judgment. If eating a plant-based diet could actually make me feel better, awesome, I'm in. If my glucose can be more controlled, if my insulin use can stop going up, if my energy levels can get picked up, cool, then I'm in. So under the guidance of a nutrition professional, his name's Dr. Doug Graham, he had gone on to write a book called the 80-10-10 diet. And he's basically a fruitarian advocate. So he teaches people how to adopt a mainly fruit-based diet.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So again, I didn't know any better. So I was like, okay, great, let's do this. So under his supervision for the first week, I went to a retreat and I was hanging out with him. And he showed me how I could take this low carbohydrate philosophy and just literally throw it out the window. He's like, it's not founded in evidence-based science. Let me teach you a different method. So I started to eat just giant plates worth of fruits and vegetables. And my carbohydrate intake, went from 100 grams a day to 600 grams a day. I mean, I was eating more carbohydrate energy than I've ever eaten before. And the rhetoric in the diabetes world is when you eat more carbohydrate, you will need more insulin.
Yeah. Based on what you hear, that makes sense, right?
Yeah. I mean, on a piece of paper, it makes a lot of sense. But what I didn't realize at the time, and what I learned through experience, was that biological processes are generally not linear. They're very complex, and biochemical pathways are grouped into, they have hundreds of different interacting intracellular signals that then create a biological effect. Point being is that this idea that eating more carbohydrate equals more insulin is not a true statement. And the reason I knew that right away was because I went from eating 100 to 600 grams of carbohydrate per day, and my insulin use, I thought, my insulin's going to go up, so I'm going to need more insulin. I might need double, I might need triple, who knows?
Yeah.
And my insulin use fell by 40%. So I was eating more carbohydrate energy for 40% less insulin. I felt way better. I was more hydrated. I had more energy. My blood glucose was more controllable. And the best part was that I could use my body way more than I had previously been able to. So I wasn't as tired. I was able to go start working out again. And I was like, it literally felt like I took a power cord or a power charger and I stuck it into a wall outlet. And I was like, whoa, here I am. This feels good.
So this is going from like a low to no carb to, I would say high carb, but a pretty high carb consumption.
Exactly. So yeah, call it low carbohydrate to high carbohydrate, sure. But I think where people have like an emotional reaction to the word carbohydrate.
Of course.
Right? You say carbohydrate, you say carb, and people are like, oh, like I gain weight just by looking at carbs. Carbs are bad for me. Carbs are
I think of Austin Powers, like carbs are the enemy.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's become this like this thing that so many people fear. And it's unfortunate because carbohydrates are basically a class of molecule that are found in many different types of foods. But there's a huge difference between the like traditional sort of like refined carbohydrates that we know to be associated with increased chronic disease, and then whole carbohydrates, which are inversely associated with chronic disease, right?
Yeah.
So people use this term carbohydrate to describe both the refined cookies and crackers and breads and chips and pasta, the refined stuff, as well as fruits and potatoes and quinoa and whole grains, which are the whole versions. The two of them have fundamentally different behaviors inside of your body. One increases your chronic disease risk, one decreases your chronic disease risk, but yet they're lumped into the same category. So people are like, oh, fruit's bad for me. Potatoes are bad for me. I shouldn't eat any of that stuff, right? So point being is that at this time in my life, I didn't know anything about diet. I literally am just this guy who's trying to make his life suck less and feel a little bit better. And then I had this awesome magical experience and I was like, wait a minute. What if this whole carbohydrate thing is overly exaggerated? So I wanted to study more and learn a little bit more what happened inside of me and, get some science on it. So I studied and I studied and I studied. And then I went and I got a PhD at UC Berkeley in nutritional biochemistry so that I could like talk science, like real hardcore.
Biochemistry, for those that haven't taken it, that is not an easy, the basic biochemistry is not an easy course. It was probably my least favorite course on the planet.
Yeah. Biochemistry
is
an
important piece, but it's like, it's very rich in content.
Yeah. Biochemistry is like, it's like physics. You either love it or you hate it. It's like licorice, right?
Yeah.
There's like nobody who's like sort of like, well, I kind of like biochemistry. You love it or you hate it. So for whatever reason, I started studying it and I was like, wow, this is a fascinating subject. Hard as heck, very confusing, but there's something very interesting that I can learn from biochemistry that can help explain what's inside of me. Plus the bigger question was, is what Cyrus experienced also applicable to other people living with either type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes?
Yeah.
Because type 2 diabetes affects 9 times as many people as type 1 diabetes. It affects, 30 million people in the United States, and it's a much bigger population. So while I was at grad school, I got to learn the ins and outs of nutrition and how it relates to the development of diabetes or the reversal of diabetes. And I learned some unbelievably powerful things while I was at school. And one of them was that what I had experienced in my body by transitioning to a more plant-focused diet and getting improved energy, reduced insulin use, reduced glucose, that this exact mechanism and exact experience has been replicated over and over and over and over and over again in the scientific literature since, I kid you not, 1920.
Oh, so maybe they kind of have an idea of what's going on?
Yeah, you think so, just a little bit. I mean, there were literally randomized control trials that were happening in 1920 and 1930 in hundreds of people. that were demonstrating the true power of a plant-based diet, specifically for diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
And, this information has been replicated over the course of time. And for whatever reason, it's either been ignored or hidden or, bypassed. And this low carbohydrate message that carbohydrates are bad for you and don't eat fruits and don't eat potatoes and don't eat quinoa and don't eat bread and rice has become more popular. And the unfortunate truth is that the popular message of carbohydrates are bad for you has some legitimacy in very specific situations. But as a general idea, a plant-based diet, a low-fat, plant-based whole food diet rich in whole carbohydrate energy, not only works for Cyrus, but also is, I kid you not, the most powerful diabetes reversal strategy that has ever been studied.
And you said low fat.
Low fat.
Which is interesting, and I'll just share some experience. I don't have type 1 or type 2 diabetes. And I eat like a combination of a lot of different things at different times in my life. I've tried, I've done carnivore, I've been plant-based, I've done paleo, I've done a combination of a lot of things over a period of time. I'm a tester, right? I like to see how my body performs as an athlete.
Absolutely.
And I can tell you with running ultra distance, right? So more than 26.2 miles, like where weeks I would be training for 20 miles a day, 4 or 5 days a week in a row, right? Just to give you like distance wise, it's a lot, right? It's a lot of energy that needs to be used.
That's huge volume.
Day after day after day. And what had happened, and I've had this conversation with other people, but innately, I didn't say I'm going to choose to eat like 80% or 90% plant-based. I gravitated towards beans and sweet potatoes and rice and salads and green. But I wasn't low fat. I always had like coconut oil and had things like that. And avocado in there. So I was probably more moderate to higher fat, but that plant-based diet was talk about energy. Like people like, how do you do 5 days in a row of 20 miles a day? How? And I that's including working 12 hours a day, certain days, a couple of those days, those 5 days, hanging out with friends after hour, like in the evening and functioning, not dragging my ass across the floor in exhaustion. So, I mean, I've seen a version of what you're talking about in my own reality. Like, holy cow, this is definitely like high octane fuel for the human body.
That's a great way to think about it. You're probably, correct me if I'm wrong, are you familiar with either Michael Arnstein or Scott Jurek or Rich Roll?
Yeah. I'm actually listening to one of Scott's books right now.
Oh, cool. Okay. So Scott's an absolute monster when it comes to, he's ultra marathoner, he's a vegan, and he's very outspoken about why a plant-based diet is his diet of choice. And we know the benefits that it has for him, not only, for his mind and his body, but also for his ability to perform and recover, specifically for endurance sports.
Yeah.
Rich Roll, same thing. He's a triathlete. He's also gone into the ultra distances. That dude's a machine.
Yep.
And, there's a lot of athletes that are very similar who are now telling people like, oh my Lord, a plant-based diet, not only, can it help me keep my, improve my overall health and keep my disease risk very low.
Yeah.
But holy smokes, from the performance and recovery side of things, this is the highest octane fuel you can possibly put in your body.
And that was my experience. And, and I've fluctuated, like I said, through many things, and I find different things help. But during that, like when I want to like have ultra, if you will, no pun intended, but that ultra performance, by far, that is my go-to now. Like now I'm making the conscious decision, but I didn't even make a conscious decision. Like your body will start to crave when it needs to perform at a certain level. It will start to crave certain things. And I didn't deny myself of, hey, listen, I want to have refried beans mixed with sweet mashed potatoes, mixed with quinoa in a big bowl covered in olive oil. Like that was my food. Like people like, how are you so lean eating all this stuff? And I don't know. I was functioned well. And I was awesome. My patients were like, this is insane. So
yeah, good. I'm glad you had that personal experience because it's once you have it, you're like, wow, this plant-based thing has, there's a lot of true power which we gain from it.
Yeah. So back to you. I just wanted to share that because I think, when you're talking about health and we're talking about diabetes and mastering like getting better, and we have our country, the US alone has, I mean, I think 30 million is probably a low number, you know?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right, because when it comes to the diagnosed population, the people who actually have gone to a doctor and a doctor basically is like, you have type 1 or type 2, the number is like somewhere between 30 and 33 million. But there's 85 million people in the United States alone that are living with pre-diabetes, which is insulin resistance.
Yeah.
And they have not been diagnosed / they don't even know about it. Right. So if you add those people to the diabetes population, because they're basically, insulin resistance is the precursor condition to type 2 diabetes. Now you're looking at 110 million people. That's 1/3
Yeah,
of
one
the
third
US
of the
population.
country.
That's an absurd number. That is an absurd number.
So I have to thank you for trying to help people already, right? You got 1/3 of the country that need you.
Yeah, exactly right. You're exactly right.
That need your message.
Yeah, and the question, unfortunately, right now in the world of diet and nutrition, it's like it's such a circus. It really is, and it's kind of like politics or religion, where there's become two different camps. There's the Republicans and the Democrats, right? There's in the nutrition world, we have the plant-based advocates and then the like low carbohydrate advocates. So, whether that's a ketogenic diet or a carnivore diet or an Atkins diet, right? It's like these two worlds are getting farther and farther and farther and farther apart. And they point fingers at each other and say, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what you're talking about. How dare you spread this information? It's incorrect. It's annoying. And our message is very simple. Plant-based diet that is low in fat. And when I say low in fat, I mean approximately 15% of your total calories as fat or less.
Really? Okay.
Something in that ballpark, right? A low fat, plant predominant or plant heavy whole food diet, again, not from refined sources, but from real foods that grow in the ground and grow on trees. When you eat low fat, plant-based whole foods, it is the most effective and most powerful method to reverse insulin resistance, which is, again, the underlying condition that causes pre-diabetes that then progresses into type 2 diabetes.
Okay.
And then for people who are living with type 1 diabetes, like myself, the reason why it's an important thing for us, or for me and people with type 1, is because even if you're living with type 1 diabetes, even if you're an athlete, even if you're an ultramarathon runner, a CrossFitter, a rower, a hiker, you name it, and you're lean and you're not overweight, you can still be insulin resistant. Because insulin resistance is a function of what you put into your mouth. It's a function of the types of calories that go into your mouth. It's a function of the quantity of calories that go into your mouth, and it's a function of specifically the total amount of fat that goes into your mouth, especially saturated fat from animal sources.
Okay.
So the more saturated fat you eat in your diet, even if the saturated fat comes from plant-based sources, most of the saturated fat in the diet is found in chicken and meat and fish and eggs. But the higher the quantity of saturated fat that comes into your mouth, the more of that saturated fat is actually stored inside of your liver and inside of your muscles, where it's actually not supposed to be in large quantities. So you eat saturated fat rich foods. Let's say you have some eggs and sausage, right, for breakfast. Some of those saturated fat molecules end up getting stored inside of your adipose tissue, your fat tissue, where it's supposed to get stored. And that's a safe place for it to be. But some of those saturated fat molecules end up literally inside of your shoulder. They can get inside of your quadriceps, inside of your shoulders, your chest, your abdomen, wherever there's muscle tissue on your body. And in addition to that, some of those saturated fat molecules can get inside of your liver as well. Now, when your liver and muscles overaccumulate saturated fatty acids over the course of time, they end up going into this mode where they're basically saying, hey, listen, we have actually too much energy inside of us. There's this thing called overnutrition, where there's effectively too much. There's a storage of excess nutrients. What they're trying to do in this situation is block more nutrients from coming in. So they want to initiate a mechanism to basically like stop fatty acids from coming in. But they can't really do it that well, because fatty acids can kind of just easily get inside of tissues when they're present in your blood. So rather than blocking fatty acids from coming in, they say, you know what, let's block that thing called insulin, because insulin is a master hormone whose job is to basically signal for glucose to come inside of a cell. So if you block insulin, then you're going to block glucose from coming in, and that's going to limit the amount of energy that's coming into the cell. So what these tissues do is they initiate insulin resistance to basically say, hey, stop paying attention to insulin. So that means that the next time you go eat a banana or, some black rice, anything that's carbohydrate rich, the glucose from those carbohydrate molecules ends up circulating in your blood, and the glucose is like, hey, now I want to try and find my way into the liver and into the muscle. Insulin knocks on the door and says, hey, by the way, there's some glucose in the blood. Do you want to take it up right now? And the cells in your liver and muscle are like, sorry, I already got this lipid droplet, this accumulated saturated fatty acid thing that I have to deal with. I'm not paying attention to you right now. Go away. So insulin is like, darn it. And insulin gets trapped in your blood. Glucose says, darn it. It gets trapped in your blood. So now you eat a banana, you check your blood glucose 2 hours later, and your blood glucose is high. And you look at, and most people in the world of diabetes and insulin resistance, they'll go, oh, it's the banana's fault. Think about it. You ate a banana and your blood glucose went high. Therefore, the banana's bad for you. Don't eat the banana, right? The last time you had a potato, the same thing happened. So clearly, carbohydrate-rich foods are bad for you. Don't eat them. So they end up limiting their carbohydrate intake and eating more fish, chicken, meat, eggs, you name it, making themselves more resistant to insulin. So that way, over the course of time, they gravitate towards a low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet. And the only way that they can keep their blood glucose controlled is if they drastically limit their carbohydrate intake. So they're basically avoiding carbohydrate-rich foods because this insulin resistance thing has built up to such a large extent that anytime they were to eat any kind of carbohydrate-rich food, blood glucose goes high.
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. This is important because like I said, I'm a tester and I see people and I'm constantly getting asked, what do I do? And I'm like, listen, I'm not the expert. This is what I've tried. These are my results. So, and I should probably test my blood sugar. Now that I'm thinking about this, like as I go. And is this like, you see this is like across the board we're talking about, right? Like if we're having like a high fat or a ketogenic style diet, that's the case 100% of the time with people. Like their body starts to respond that way to when you add a carbohydrate, whether it's a banana or a Snickers bar, it's still going to go crazy.
It's skyrocket. Yeah. And so so what I want listeners to understand is that like Cyrus didn't invent this science. It's not like Cyrus just decided to create this story and it's just going around telling the world that, right? This has been shown in the research over and over and over again. Now, there's multiple things that we can talk about, like specific pieces of evidence. One of them in particular is actually fascinating. There are some studies that are done in people living with type 1 diabetes like myself, because people with type 1 diabetes are incredible test subjects. We don't manufacture insulin. So you can do an experiment on somebody living with type 1 diabetes and you can control exactly how much insulin goes into their body. And that gives you a really simple way to measure how their insulin needs change given specific situations.
Okay.
So there are some studies that actually show that you can stabilize a person on using a certain amount of insulin every single day by eating what's considered like a standard baseline diet that's medium fat, medium carbohydrate, medium protein, right? Then what you do is you feed them one high-fat meal for dinner. And that high-fat meal contains saturated fat from animal sources, but also unsaturated fat from things like nuts and seeds and maybe some avocados.
Okay.
So you feed them one high-fat meal, and then what you do is you monitor how much their blood glucose deviates from baseline, and you monitor how much insulin they require in order to keep their blood glucose flat over the course of the next 12 hours. And what many of these research papers have done, like multiple of them, have found that a single high-fat meal increases your insulin use by as much as 65% over the course of the next 12 hours. So your blood glucose goes up. The amount of insulin required in order to keep your blood glucose down is as much as 65%. Okay. Now, again, this isn't people with type 1 diabetes. And again, we're just sort of like good test beds. This same thing happens in people who are not living with type 1 diabetes. It's just that rather than injecting insulin through an insulin pump or a needle or a syringe, their pancreas is being forced to make that extra 65%, right?
Got it.
There was also a study that was recently published in the last year by this company named Virta, and they they teach people living with type 2 diabetes how to eat a ketogenic diet to quote unquote reverse type 2 diabetes. So they published a paper in which they talked about this is what happens after 2 years of following a ketogenic diet. And they had all these amazing, like the way that the research study was being talked about was that they were truly reversing type 2 diabetes. So I took a deep dive into this paper and I just looked at every single number in this paper. And what I realized was very obvious is that what we talked about, people developing insulin resistance was actually going up over the course of time. So over the course of 2 years, their individuals at the end of a 2-year period actually had fasting blood glucose values that were considered type 2 diabetic. So they claim on the outside that they're reversing type 2 diabetes. But if you look at the numbers in the paper say that their fasting glucose was 136. And that's clearly type 2.
Yeah.
Take a look at their fasting insulin. Their fasting insulin is in the 17s. That's hardcore insulin resistant. Okay, you look at their A1C values, which is a sort of an average measure of blood glucose concentration. Yeah. Their A1C values are elevated, 6.7%. That's type 2 diabetes. So the outside world, the story that's told to the outside world, to the press, to the reporters, is that we're reversing type 2 diabetes because they were able to reduce medication use in many of these individuals.
And then size and weight and possibly even things like that, or like the very visual aspects of it, like the weight loss portion of it.
The weight loss. So they lost a tremendous amount of weight. I'm trying to remember the number, but I can't remember off the top of my head. They lost weight. They came off of a lot of diabetes medications, and they reduced their insulin use from something like 80 units a day down to like 11 units a day, which is awesome. Don't give me any, I'll give them full credit for that. But even though they were using less medication, even though they were slender, more skinny individuals, their metabolic health told a different story. Their metabolic health indicates that they're still living with type 2 diabetes, that they're still insulin resistant, and that they still have elevated blood glucose values. But again, the story that's being told to the outside world is that we're reversing diabetes. Now, full transparency here, I have friends that work at Virta, and I don't mean in any way, shape, or form to be talking ill about them as a company. This is about the science of ketogenic diets. The science of low carbohydrate diets is that it's faulty. And even though it might look good from the outside, visually from the inside, there's a significant amount of metabolic damage which is accruing over the course of time, which is actually increasing chronic disease risk rather than reversing it.
We wanted to let you know that this episode is brought to you by the 3065 Lifestyle Shift program. It's a 365-day-a-year, community-based, social media-driven program. Have you struggled with wanting to exercise more, eat better, or even have a better mindset? If you've answered yes to one or all of those questions, then check out the link in the show notes to find out how you can participate in being a better version of yourself. And now back to the show. That's interesting because I guess the way we look at everything in this world is superficially in general.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. Like, listen, if I'm losing weight, like that's just the way, I guess, the perceived positive portion of it. Like, oh, I'm losing weight, I'm less medication, those things must be working. But, and I've thought about this with the ketogenic diet and things like this with people. Are these things sustainable long term? Because almost anybody you talk to about going and having a ketogenic diet, they're always talking about, cycle in, cycle out.
Yeah, exactly. And, the ketogenic diet, I think, has a lot of merits. In the short term, there's a lot of dramatic improvements which can happen. You lose weight, reduce cholesterol, reduce your blood glucose in the short term. But then in the long term, after the course of 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years, people end up with increased chronic diseases. They have digestive issues. Sometimes they have chronic headaches. Sometimes they can't lose weight anymore. Their LDL cholesterol goes up. Their blood pressure starts increasing. And then they come to us and they say, hey, we know you guys talk about a plant-based diet, to really improve diabetes health. Can I talk with you? Let's talk about maybe this is a better long-term solution for me.
Yeah, I think it's long-term. So I think we're going to do a part 2 of this because I think we're running out of time anyway, and we're going to cut it in a few minutes. But I want to connect people with you because they're going to hear part 1 and they're going to want part 2. So we know we have a new book out that you said has been like years of blood, sweat, and tears and content being poured into this book. Tell us a little bit about the book.
Okay, cool. So this book right here, you can see on the screen, it's called Mastering Diabetes. And I wrote this right here. That's me at the top. And then that's my business partner, Robbie Barbero. He also has type 1 diabetes.
Okay.
And the two of us have put together this book because this is, we want this to be sort of the go-to manifesto, if you will, for people living with all forms of diabetes to adopt a plant-based diet to reverse the underlying cause of blood glucose variation, which is insulin resistance, right? So this book basically it's a big boy. It's like 400 pages long.
I can see that.
It took 2 years to write, and we put in so much work into writing this thing. One of the things that we wanted to make sure of is that we had the research down pat, and that we weren't making things up.
Yeah.
That there's this thing in research where you have a preconceived bias of what you want to be true, and then you go look for research that supports that claim. Yeah. Right.
Validates it, right? Yeah.
Validates that claim, right?
Yeah.
And so we wanted to make sure that we were not doing that. So at every point in the way, we would find some study that was like pro-plant, and we'd be like, hold on. What is the counterpoint? Show me the opposite. And so we were constantly telling ourselves don't fall victim to a preconceived bias. Don't. And so in this process, we really scoured, low carbohydrate, high carbohydrate, plant, not plant. And we put together 800 scientific references in this thing. And these 800 scientific references are really sort of telling a pretty powerful story, which is that a plant-based diet is something that's been so powerful for almost 100 years at this point. We got to start talking about it. Because the world is moving in the opposite direction right now. People are getting more unhealthy over time. Diabetes is growing at an exponential rate. Wait a minute, maybe this could be, one of the most powerful solutions ever invented.
Yeah. And also before you keep going, because I know you got to go as well. What's the best place for people to find you?
Okay.
What's the best place?
So the best place to find us on the web, go to masteringdiabetes.org. Masteringdiabetes.org. On that website, you can do all types of stuff. We have scientific information written on our blog. We have our own podcast. We have testimonials. We have recipes. You name it. If you are looking for this book, which I highly recommend getting a copy of this book. It's not only hardcover, it's also Kindle. It's also audiobook. Just go to Amazon, type in Mastering Diabetes, and it'll pop right up. There's a picture of a bunch of fruits and vegetables on the cover. That's the book. Highly recommend it. And, we've seen this method transform the lives of 3,000 plus individuals. We've seen it. We've coached it in our coaching program. Now the point is to put this in front of more people so that they can actually put it into place in their lives and see what kind of, transformations they can get.
And I also think, as the conversation, as we're going to continue in the future here on the next episode, is you don't necessarily need to have type 1 or type 2 diabetes to have a healthy lifestyle and a healthy, eating lifestyle and habits. So if you don't have type 1 or type 2 diabetes, this book doesn't mean this is not for you. It means
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Just like you're talking about. You don't have to have type 1 or type 2. You don't have to be part of that 85 million people who have insulin resistance and prediabetes. You could just be a normal dude. You could just be an athlete. You could just be, a woman who's looking to improve your health. And this approach for low-fat, plant-based whole food nutrition can definitely help you out. And it can not only prevent you from developing any form of diabetes, but it can also minimize your risk for cardiovascular disease, for Alzheimer's disease, fatty liver disease, chronic kidney disease, you name it.
Very cool. Well, everyone, Cyrus here. This is part 1 of the Mastering Diabetes talk. So, man, I want to thank you. This has been a pleasure, and I can't wait for part 2. It's gonna get a little more spicy, I hope.
I appreciate you having me on here. This has been really fun, and thanks for really putting more natural health out into the world. I think there's a huge lack of it right now, and I totally appreciate all the time and effort you put into it because it's making a big difference.
Thank you.